Hello, everybody, and welcome back once again to the latest and hopefully greatest of actual factual TV. We're going to be doing some true stories 2 to 4 times a week, and all throughout the meantime, we are going to overload you on random, amazing, intriguing information in the form of shorts. So, we're going to have 2 to 4 long format videos a week and a whole bunch of shorts. So, comment, and subscribe to kind of help the algorithm and let me know what you guys think. Now, without further ado, today's story is something that was requested. You guys wanted to hear about something supernatural, and you also wanted to hear about war stories, and you also wanted to hear about people exploring places they shouldn't. So we've already done something about someone exploring somewhere they probably shouldn't. So today we are going to do a war story, but this is not going to be any war story like you've ever heard before, because it's also going to throw in a supernatural twist. And don't forget, all we tell are true stories. So this is a true story, 100%. So let's get into it. 1967 Vietnam was not a place that anyone wanted to find themselves, including the locals and the Viet Cong soldiers themselves, not only because of the fact that there was a war raging on, but something much more horrifying was about to happen that was going to blow everybody's minds. Now, during this time, we are in the height of the Vietnam War, and there's battles and everything taking place all over, including the deepest parts of the jungle where the Viet Cong were thought to have sort of a home field advantage, in that they were more familiar with their thick, dense jungles than the foreigners were. Now, at this point, we have to note that the Vietnamese have a sort of ritual type of deal where when somebody dies, they're supposed to be buried at the place of their birth to help with the contentment of the soul and to basically help the spirit pass over once one has been deceased. However, during this war, where they were often deep in the thickest, densest parts of the jungle, a lot of times they were unable to retrieve the fallen soldiers' bodies, and if they weren't able to take them all the way back to their birthplace to be buried. So they would oftentimes end up just laying there where they died, or they would be put into mass graves. Now, the Vietnamese were aware of this, but they didn't necessarily like it, but they kind of chucked it up as to one of those you gotta do what you gotta do sometimes type of situations. So they continued to do it, what they needed to do to, hold their place in the war. However, one night, some soldiers began to hear some sounds that weren't particularly normal, even in these dense parts of the jungle. So after dark, when things were usually a bit quieter, the Viet Cong began to hear sounds like kind of surrounding them. And I don't mean they were hearing people talking or moving or anything like that. I mean, they had no idea what they were hearing, but all they knew is that it was all around them. They could hear it coming from up, they can hear it coming from around and behind them. It was all over the place, and they didn't know what was going on. So after listening to the sounds for a little while, they started to realize they did know what they were hearing. They were hearing an array of things, from banging to wailing and screaming, and there were even some reports that they were hearing the voices of their fallen comrades in battle. And these voices were coming from everywhere. It felt like they were all around them. And it didn't take long at all for the Vietnamese to realize what they were hearing. These were the sounds of the countless soldiers that had died. It was their souls that were stuck in torment, or basically in limbo, because they hadn't been taken back to their birthplace and buried like they were supposed to. So now their souls were kind of just stuck lingering around in torment until they were able to somehow cross over into the afterlife. Now eventually these sounds and voices really started to ramp up, and the Viet Cong were absolutely freaking out. There are reports that hundreds of these guys actually wound up fleeing the battlefield. Like, they just abandoned their post, abandoned their company, did everything. They were gone. They did not want to deal with this, and who can really blame them? And those who remained were not unaffected, as it is believed it started to drive them mad a little bit while they were shooting all around them, and they would start like yelling back and all kinds of things that probably aren't the best thing to do in the middle of a jungle in a battlefield. And this would continue for years, and rumors would spread far and wide about the hauntings of this jungle in the late 60s and early 70s. There were even reports that farmers would refuse to work certain portions of land because they too could hear these voices coming from deep within these haunted woods. And as time went on, they would hear all kinds of crazy stuff coming out of these woods, from women and children screaming and crying to the voices of their fallen soldiers, and sometimes they would really be able to make out what they were saying, and their fallen comrades were telling them to surrender and give up this war. It's not worth it. And then things took an even darker turn when these voices started trying to convince and command the Viet Cong soldiers to harm themselves in extremely violent ways. And then, in the year 1971, out of nowhere, all the voices and sounds that were coming from inside this jungle, they would suddenly just stop and seemingly go away. It would be many years before people learned what was actually going on in that jungle, and the truth was just as twisted as everyone had thought. It turns out the US and allies were trying out new war tactics to try and further their interests in this war. And so, in approximately 1965, the U.S. Army's 6th PSYOP Battalion was formed in cooperation with the U.S. Navy, and they would then launch what is called Operation Wandering Soul. The Wandering Soul operation was intended to frighten and demoralize the enemy and hopefully compel many to desert their positions and ultimately surrender the war. In many cases, the Viet Cong would be so freaked out by these noises they would start trying to shoot back or run away, which would reveal their positions to the enemy, and they would be immediately attacked. So basically, they would react to these terrifying voices and sounds, and that would lead to them being picked off one by one with a big old target on their backs. The sounds were actually part of a taped broadcast that was being blasted across the entire countryside by U.S. forces with portable PA speakers. And in fact, the entire program had been taped just weeks before, and it's reported there were actually Vietnam prisoners of war and defects or traitors that were voiced in these tapes to make them as authentic as they possibly could. Now, after a while, the Viet Cong did start to catch on, and so these operations and missions would become much less successful over time, and ultimately it led to the end of the operation. But not before making its mark on thousands of soldiers and even on southern Vietnamese civilians and military who were actually allies of the U.S. but still followed these beliefs, and they were not in on it because it was a top secret operation and no one was aware of its existence until all these years later when they finally came out and told us. If you guys like today's story, leave a like down below, leave a comment, do something to let me know I'm doing something right. Comment with any suggestions on anything you'd like to hear about in the future. Like I said, this one was voted on by a poll. And with that, we are done here. Have a good one.